My mother put her hand over mine and pushed the pen down to the page. I was 15 years old. The page was a property deed. The pen was leaving a thin blue line across a signature box at the bottom that said, Sephora Korsakov, in my own 7th grade handwriting. My grandmother had been dead for 9 days. My fingers had been cold the whole morning. My mother's hand had been warm. I want you to picture this very carefully. I was sitting at the small wooden table in my parents' kitchen, the one with the chip on the corner where I had once knocked over a glass of milk when I was 8. The morning light was coming through the back window in long, pale bars across the laminate floor. My father was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching. My older brother, Auden, who was 18, was sitting in the chair across from me with his hands folded in his lap, and his face turned slightly toward the window so that I could not see his eyes. There was a stack of papers between us. There was a kettle on the stove that had been about to whistle for the last 2 minutes that nobody had stood up to take off the burner. The whistle was building. Nobody moved. My mother said, "Sign it or you're out of the family." I want you to know something about that sentence. I want you to know that my mother had a particular voice she used when she was about to do something cruel. The voice was not loud. It was lower than her normal voice, and slower and very calm. She had used the voice 3 times before in my life that I could remember. Once when she had told my grandmother she could not visit anymore because of some argument over a wedding. Once when she had told my father she was leaving, although she had not actually left, and they had stayed married. Once when she had told me, when I was 11, that I needed to lose 10 pounds before my Christmas concert. The voice was always the same. The voice was a knife she carried in her mouth, and she only took it out when she had decided in advance that she was going to use it. I signed. I signed because the voice had decided I would. I signed because my brother was not looking at me. I signed because my father was not going to say anything. I signed because the kettle on the stove was whistling now, the high, thin whistle that meant it had been whistling for a long time and had built up a kind of pressure that none of us were going to stop. And the whistle felt, in that moment, like the only thing in the room that was telling the truth about what was actually happening. The deed transferred my grandmother's house, the small brick row house on Maple Street where I had spent every Sunday afternoon of my childhood, to my brother. The reason my mother had given me, in the days leading up to the signing, had been that the transfer was for tax purposes. She had said it in the voice she used for everything she did not want me to question. She had said it would save the family thousands. She had said it would not change anything about what the house meant to anybody. That had been a lie. 10 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, a real estate agent named Mr. Bertram Aoki called me at the small public library in our town where I worked as a reference librarian. He told me he had a private listing he wanted me to know about. He told me the property was a 3-bedroom brick row house on Maple Street, and that it had been valued at $4.2 million, and that the seller had specifically requested he approach me first, with an offer to purchase the house at half of market value. He told me he had no idea why I had been chosen for this offer, and that he had been instructed not to ask. He told me I had until the end of the week to decide. I sat at the reference desk with the phone in my hand for almost a minute after Mr. Aoki had hung up. I did not move. I want to tell you what I felt in that minute, because the feeling is the seed of the story I am about to tell you, and I want to be honest about it. What I felt was rage. The rage I had been carrying about that house and about my brother for 10 years surfaced inside me in the kind of single moment that explains why people make rash decisions. I had been hating my brother quietly, in a low, daily way since I was 15 years old. I had not seen him in person in 4 years. I had blocked him on social media. I had let our parents tell me over the years what he had been doing with the house, and I had been believing every word of it, and the words had built up inside me into a weight I had been carrying around like a small stone in my shoe for a decade. The weight of that stone, the morning Mr. Aoki called, was the heaviest it had been since the kitchen. I told Mr. Aoki yes. I had $40,000 saved from 10 years of working part-time through high school and full-time after college. I told him I would arrange a mortgage for the rest. I told him I would view the house on Saturday morning at 10. I told him I wanted to be the one to walk through the front door of the house my brother had stolen from me when I was a child, and I wanted to be the buyer, and I wanted my brother to know I had outbid him on his own life. What happened on Saturday morning at 10, on the front porch of my grandmother's house, is the part of this story I am still trying to figure out how to tell. My name is Sephora Korsakov. I am 25 years old. I have been hating my brother for the last 10 years on the basis of a story I now know was not the story I had been told. I want to tell you what I learned at that house on Saturday, and what I have done with it in the year since, and what I want you to know if you are sitting somewhere right now hating somebody in your own family, on the basis of a story you have been told by people who may not have been telling you the whole thing. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a person in your family who you have spent years being angry at, and then later found out that the version of them you had been angry at was not the version that actually existed. Tell me how old you were when you found out. Tell me what changed afterward. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to my grandmother, because the rest of this story does not work without her. My grandmother's name was Galina Korsakov. She had emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1965 when she was 22 years old with my grandfather, who had been a chemist, and a small leather suitcase that contained the only photographs and documents she had been able to bring out of the country. She had spent the first 3 years in this country in a small apartment in New York City, working as a seamstress, while my grandfather had retrained as a high school chemistry teacher. They had moved to a small town in central Massachusetts in 1968, when my grandfather had been offered a teaching job at the public high school. They had bought the small brick row house on Maple Street in 1971, with money they had saved for 6 years, and they had lived in that house for 53 years. My grandfather had died of a stroke in 2004 when I was 4. My grandmother had stayed in the house alone for the next 11 years. I had been the grandchild who came over on Sundays. My brother Auden had also come over when our parents had insisted, but Auden had been 3 years older than me, and by the time he had been 13, he had had basketball practice on Sundays, and the visits had become less frequent. I had been the one who had stayed. I had spent every Sunday afternoon at my grandmother's kitchen table from the time I had been 6 until the time I had been 15. We had baked, we had read. She had taught me Russian phrases I have not forgotten. She had told me stories about her own grandmother, who had been a midwife in a small town outside St. Petersburg, and who had delivered 300 babies in her life with hands my grandmother had described to me as the strongest hands she had ever seen. My grandmother had loved me in a way that had been, until I was 15, the warmest love I had ever experienced from anybody. She had died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of my sophomore year of high school. She had been 72. She had been sick for 9 months. I had visited her at the hospital almost every day in the last 3 weeks of her life. She had not been able to talk much in the last days. She had held my hand. She had whispered to me in Russian the same phrase 3 or 4 times, which had translated to, "The house is for you, my Sephora, the house is yours." I had assumed at the time that she had been confused. She had not been confused. I had been wrong about that for 10 years. The funeral had been on a Saturday. The kitchen signing had been the following Tuesday. The deed had transferred the house to Auden by Friday. By the next Sunday, my grandmother had been buried for 9 days, and the house had not been mine, and the kettle had stopped whistling, and I had not been allowed to ask any further questions. I want to tell you what I had been told about my brother in the years that followed. My mother had told me in the months after the signing that Auden had been planning to sell the house. She had said he had been talking to realtors. She had said he had been trying to figure out the best moment to put it on the market. She had told me Auden had said he wanted to use the proceeds to buy a sports car. She had told me he had been laughing about it. A year later, my mother had told me he had not sold the house yet because the market had been bad. She had said he had been waiting for a better year. She had told me he had been making no improvements to the property because he did not care about it. She had told me the house was deteriorating because Auden was not maintaining it. 2 years later, my mother had told me Auden had moved into the house himself. She had said he had been freeloading on a property that should have been sold. She had said he had been eating my grandmother's food, which had still been in her cupboards, and refusing to throw out her clothes from her bedroom because he was lazy. She had said he had been taking advantage. 5 years later, my mother had told me Auden had been making his own money from a small landscaping business he had started. She had said he had been building it because he did not have any actual ambition. She had said landscaping was beneath the family. She had said he had been embarrassing the family by working with his hands. By the time I was 23, I had been told a complete picture of my brother. The picture was the picture of a young man who had stolen his sister's inheritance, lived in it for free, refused to sell it, and built a small, embarrassing career while squandering the property's value. I had not seen him in years. I had stopped responding to his texts when he had tried to reach out, around year 5. I had unfollowed him on every social media platform. I had let the family narrative become my narrative, in the way you do when you are too young and too tired to push back on the version your parents are giving you. Mr. Aoki's call, 10 years after the kitchen, had landed on top of all of that. The call had not been confusing to me at the time. The call had made perfect sense. My brother had finally decided to sell. He had set the price at $4.2 million, which was slightly above market value because he had wanted to look like he was driving a hard bargain. He had been instructed by somebody, I assumed my mother, to offer it to me first at half price, as a kind of family gesture. The whole thing had been, in my reading, the final cruelty in a 10-year cruelty. Selling me back at a discount, the house I had been forced to sign away. I had been ready to walk in there and humiliate him. That is not what happened. Saturday morning happened, and it was the slowest thing I have ever lived through, and I want to tell it to you in the order it took place. I drove to the house at 9:45 in the morning. I parked across the street. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I went up. I want to tell you what I noticed about the house from the car because I had not been to that street in 4 years, and the noticing is the first thing that started to crack the story I had been told. The house looked beautiful. The brick had been recently repointed. The trim around the windows had been freshly painted. The small front porch had been completely rebuilt, with new wood that had been stained a dark walnut color my grandmother would have liked. There were 2 pots of mums on the porch, in deep red and orange. The small front yard had been planted with native grasses and a young Japanese maple. The front walk was even. The mailbox was new. The house did not look like a house that had been allowed to deteriorate for 10 years. It looked like a house that had been quietly, lovingly, expensively maintained. I sat in the car for another 5 minutes. I called my mother. She did not answer. I texted my mother. I asked her if Auden was at the house this morning. She did not respond. I got out of the car. I walked across the street. I walked up the new walk. I climbed the new porch steps. The front door was open. I could see, through the screen, into the front hallway of my grandmother's house. The same hallway with the same Persian runner I remembered from my childhood, recently cleaned, the small mirror by the door still hanging in the same place where my grandfather had hung it in 1971. The hallway looked the way it had looked when I was 12. I rang the doorbell. I heard footsteps. A man came to the door. The man was my brother. He was 28. He had not been 28 the last time I had seen him. He had been 24. He looked older than 4 years should have made him. He was thinner than I remembered. He had a small beard. He had paint on his hands. He was wearing a flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. He saw me. He did not look surprised. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment, possibly for a very long time, and who had not been sure it would actually arrive until I had rung the doorbell. He said, "Sephora, I am so glad you came. Will you sit on the porch with me? There is something I have to give you, and I want to give it to you here, before you come into the house, because the porch is the right place for it." I had been planning, in the car, what I was going to say to him when he opened the door. I had rehearsed several versions of it. None of the versions had been ready for the version of him that had answered. I did not say what I had been planning to say. I said, "Okay." He gestured to the porch swing my grandfather had built in 1972, and that had been on that porch for 53 years. The swing had been recently restained. The chains had been replaced. There was a small cushion on it that I did not recognize, in a faded blue floral pattern that looked like the kind of fabric my grandmother would have had in her sewing room. We sat on the swing. He did not start the swing moving. He let it stay still. He went back into the house. He came out with a folder. The folder was old. It was a manila folder, the kind that had been used for nothing in particular for 30 years, and that had been stuffed full of papers, with the papers sticking out at the edges. The folder was labeled, in what I recognized as my grandmother's handwriting, with a single Russian word. The word, when he handed me the folder and I opened it, turned out to mean, "for after." Inside the folder was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a will. The will was my grandmother's will. The will was dated 3 years before her death. The will had been notarized at a small law office in our town. The notary's stamp was clear and visible. The witnesses were 2 neighbors of my grandmother's who I recognized from my childhood, both of whom had also passed away in the years since, but whose signatures were on the document, dated and clean. The will left the house at 412 Maple Street to me, Sephora Korsakov, in its entirety. It left a savings account, with an account number listed, to me as well, in the amount that the account had contained at the time of the will's drafting, which had been $380,000. The will explicitly disinherited my parents. The will said, in language that read like my grandmother's voice, "I have left these things to my granddaughter Sephora because she is the only member of the family who has shown up to the house I built. The rest of the family has shown up to the value of it. Sephora is going to be a person who carries the house. The house should be hers. I read the will 3 times. I sat on the porch swing in the morning light with my hands shaking. My brother sat next to me. He did not say anything for a long time. He let me read. When I had finished the 3rd reading, I looked at him. I said, "Auden, how long have you had this?" "I found it 6 years ago," he said. "It was in the attic. Grandma had hidden it inside the wall behind the cedar chest. The wood paneling was loose. I found it because I was patching the roof and a beam had to be repositioned. The will had been there since she signed it. I do not know if she had told anybody. The lawyer who notarized it had died a year before her. The witnesses had already passed. I think she had been planning to tell me and had not gotten around to it before she got sick. I think she had wanted to tell you, but she had been too sick by the end. She had hidden it in a place she had assumed I would eventually find. I am sorry it took me so long." I sat with the folder in my lap. I could not speak. He said, "Sephora, I want to tell you what I have been doing for 10 years. I want to tell you because you have not known. I have been the only person in the family who has known. I have been keeping it that way on purpose. I am going to tell you now." He told me. He told me slowly. He told me in the order it had happened. I want to tell it to you the way he told it to me, because the order is the only thing that helps the story make sense. The day after my grandmother's funeral, my parents had pulled Auden aside. They had told him, in the same kitchen where they would later force me to sign the deed, that the family had agreed the house would be transferred to him for tax purposes. They had told Auden that he would sign the eventual sale when the time came, and that the proceeds would be split among the 4 of us. They had told him, when he had asked questions, that this had been the family's plan all along, and that I had agreed to it, and that he should not bring it up to me because the topic upset me. Auden had been 18. He had not pushed back. He had signed. The day they had brought me into the kitchen, 4 days later, was the first time Auden had realized that I had not actually agreed to anything. He had sat across from me at the table and watched my mother put her hand over mine and push the pen down. He had not been able to do anything. He had been too young and too afraid of our mother and too unsure of what was really happening, and he had let it happen. He told me, on the porch 10 years later, that the moment our mother had said, "Sign it or you are out of the family," had been the moment he had realized that everything they had told him was a lie, and that the moment had also been the moment he had decided he was going to do something about it, although it would take him a year to figure out what. What he had decided to do was hold the line. He had told our parents, 3 months after the signing, that he was not going to sell the house. They had been furious. He had told them, in a calm voice, that he had decided to hold on to the property until he was ready, and that he did not need their input. He had been, in the years that followed, the person at the family dinner table who had taken every accusation our mother had thrown at him and absorbed it without correcting the record. He had let our parents tell me he was selling. He had let them tell me he was greedy. He had let them tell me he was lazy. He had not corrected any of it. He had been told, when he had once tried to explain to me what he was actually doing, by our mother, that if he ever told me the truth, the family would cut him off completely. He had let them think he had been intimidated. He had not been intimidated. He had been waiting. He had taken out a small loan in his own name, at 20, when our parents had stopped paying the property taxes on the house. He had paid the taxes himself, and the insurance, and the gas bill, and the electric bill, for the entire time the house had been technically his on paper. He had moved into the house at 22, when our parents had started talking about renting it out. He had told our parents, in front of his lawyer, that he had a legal right as the owner to occupy the property, and that any attempt to remove him would be met with legal action. He had repointed the brick himself. He had rebuilt the porch with 2 friends from his landscaping business. He had restained the swing. He had repaired the roof. He had patched the foundation. He had spent 10 years of his own money, his own time, his own back, keeping the house intact. He had also, on 3 separate occasions over the years, refused to sell the house when our parents had brought him offers from buyers. The 3rd time, when I had been 22, our father had threatened him physically. Auden had filed a restraining order against our father. The restraining order had been granted. Our father had not been allowed at the house since. He had not told me any of this because he had decided, when he had been 20, that the only way he was going to be able to keep the house safe for me was if I did not know about it. He had reasoned that if I had known, I would have fought our parents. I would have insisted on the property being returned to me. Our parents would have applied pressure. They were the kind of people who applied pressure. They would have manipulated the situation, possibly for years. The house would have been at risk during that whole time. He had decided that the safest way to protect the house had been to let me hate him. He had absorbed 10 years of my hatred. He had let me believe a story he could have corrected at any time. He had taken the daily punishment of being the sibling I did not speak to, the brother I had blocked, the family member I had decided was lost to me. He had done this on the calculation that the house, and eventually the truth, would be more important to me than the years of relationship he had been sacrificing. He told me all of this on the porch swing. He did not cry while he told me. He was very quiet. He had been carrying it for a long time, and the carrying had become its own kind of muscle, and the telling, finally, was a relief he did not know how to fully feel. I cried for both of us. I cried in a way I had not cried since the morning my grandmother had died. I cried with my hands over my face, and Auden sat next to me on the swing, and he did not try to make it stop. He let me cry for almost an hour. The Japanese maple in the front yard was turning orange. The leaves were dropping into the new grass. The morning had become afternoon. When I had calmed down, I asked him about the realtor, the 4.2 million, the half-price offer. He had used Mr. Aoki, he told me, because he had needed to get me to the house alone. He had not been able to call me. Our parents had been monitoring my phone for years, he believed. He had been right about that, although I had not yet known. The realtor had been an excuse. The price had been a fiction. There was no sale. He had been planning to transfer the house to me, with my grandmother's will as the legal foundation, for $1. The savings account, which he had also located, was already in a separate trust account he had set up in my name, with Grandma's death certificate and the will as the proof. The total, with 10 years of conservative growth, was $440,000. I asked him why he had told Mr. Aoki to set the price at 4.2 million. He smiled, for the first time that morning. He said, "Because I knew you would pick up the phone and say yes if you thought you were buying it back from me. The story you have been carrying is that I stole it. The only way I could get you to come to the house was to confirm that story. I needed you to believe I was selling it. I am sorry I had to lie to you, even on a phone call I was not on." We sat on the porch for the rest of the afternoon. I went into the house eventually, and I walked through every room. The house had been preserved. My grandmother's small kitchen still had her teacups in the cabinet, washed and dried and put back where she had kept them. Her bedroom still had the lace curtains she had sewn herself. Her sewing room still had her sewing machine, oiled and covered. Her photographs were still on the mantel. Auden had not removed a single thing. He had only fixed what had been broken. He had been keeping the house as my grandmother had left it, for 10 years. For me. I want to tell you what happened after that because the after is the part of the story that matters most. I confronted my parents at a family dinner 2 weeks later. I did not bring my brother. I went alone. I brought the will. I brought a copy of the deed with my name on it, properly transferred, witnessed and notarized by Ms. Heloise Adamek, the lawyer my brother had introduced me to. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had been forced to sign at 15. I read the will out loud. I told my parents what I now knew. I told them I knew about my mother's hand on mine. I told them I knew about the threats to my brother. I told them I knew about the years of lies. My mother started to defend herself. I held up my hand. I said, "Mom, I am not having a conversation about this with you. I am telling you what I know. I am telling you that you have spent 10 years telling me a story about my brother that was not true. I am telling you that the next time I see you, if I see you again, will be on my own terms, in a place I choose, on a day I have decided is the right day. The relationship we are going to have going forward is going to be one I designed from scratch. The relationship we have had until now is over. I want you to know that. I want my father to know it too." I left without finishing dinner. I have not been to that house since. I moved into my grandmother's house 6 weeks later. Auden moved out. He bought a small place 10 minutes away, with money he had been saving from his landscaping business, which had become, over the 10 years, a successful small company that employed 11 people. He had not been embarrassing the family. He had been building something. The business is profitable. The business is his. I opened a small bookstore cafe on the first floor of my grandmother's house 6 months ago. The bookstore is named Galina's, after her. I serve Russian tea. I sell used books and a few new ones. I host a reading series in the front parlor on Sunday afternoons. The neighbors have come. Auden helped me install the shelving. He came over every weekend for 2 months and we built the bookcases together. We talked while we built them. We talked about the years we had lost. We talked about what it would mean to try to have, going forward, the kind of sibling relationship we had not been allowed to have growing up. We are figuring it out slowly. My parents sent me a letter a few months ago. The letter was a kind of apology. It was not a real apology. It was the kind of apology that lists the ways the apologizing person feels they were misunderstood. I read it once. I did not respond. Some apologies are not for the person they are addressed to. Some apologies are for the person writing them. I am not going to do the work of receiving an apology that is mostly about somebody else's discomfort with what they did. I want to tell you what I have learned, because I think this is the part that may matter most. Some siblings spend 10 years carrying things alone, knowing they cannot tell you because telling you would put you in danger. The version of your brother you have been angry at for 10 years may not be the brother you actually have. He may be a man holding the line. The line may have been you. He may be absorbing punishment that is meant for somebody else, because somebody else is too dangerous, and he is the only person in the family who can take it without breaking. Some loves cannot announce themselves while